Scotland. When Sam Willett concludes his remarks, Amazing Grace will be sung by Judy Rosebrook, and the commemoration will close. Thank you. Mr. Jerry Cashin, please.
My name is Sam Willett. And as the young lady mentioned, I was General Grant's very unofficial bodyguard. I was not an intimate of the family, but I hope they believe I am one of the best friends they could ever have. I was with them all summer, from the day in June they arrived until the sad day the General's body left the mountain. I got to know the Grant family. I got to meet every visitor to the cottage, talked with most of them. And I have some observations. I think we can tell a lot about a man by taking a look at the people who admired and revered him. We all honor General Grant for his great military story, his indispensable story in our nation's history. But many of those who came to the cottage came not just to remember and thank a military man. They came for many other reasons too. And in explaining some of those reasons, I think I can illuminate a little about General Grant that otherwise could not be known. Let me start first, however, by explaining how I came to be an unofficial bodyguard. When I heard that the General was coming to the mountain, I foresaw something that his entourage did not. Very specifically, the big hotel on the mountaintop, the Balmoral. On any given day, I knew there could be 300 guests. I'm a local boy. I knew about the hotel. It occurred to me that when the General was here, out on the porch with his family, out on the porch working on his book, the guests at the hotel would just suddenly come down here in large numbers, not meaning to interfere, but inevitably interfering with the work the man had to do. They'd want to shake his hand, They might want his autograph. Again, meaning no harm, they would take up too much of his precious time. We all knew he was dying. So I took it upon myself. I conferred with the people that own the Balmoral, and I asked, could I set up a tent on the little hill between the cottage and the hotel? And they said yes. In fact, they gave me my tent. It was a very big tent. I could put a cook stove in there. Very nice cot. Very comfortable for me. And from my tent entrance, I could watch the cottage 24 hours a day. And when those well-meaning guests from the hotel came down here, began clustering around the general, I would scamper down from my tent. I wasn't exactly a bodyguard, but I attempted some degree of crowd control. That was my mission, and I was here all summer. And as I say, I got to know, meet, and conversed with many of the people that came to visit the general. And from their stories, I think I can tell you, I think I can give you some insights into General Grant himself. Now, the sort of person you would expect to come here would be a man like Governor Samuel Pingree. He was elected governor of Vermont just last year. I'm sure you all remember the election. What you may not know is that during the war, Mr. Pingree was a captain in the 3rd Vermont. And in the spring of 1862, in a fight with the rebels in Virginia, at a place called Lee's Falls, he was so unbelievably heroic and self-sacrificing that he won the Medal of Honor. Samuel Pingree, fellow veteran, fellow soldier, fellow hero. This is the kind of person you would expect would visit the general. And then there were soldiers here all summer. There were. But there was also a group of people who thought they were not in that band of brothers who went off to war, but a group of people who felt because of their political prominence, of course, the doors would open to the general's sick room for them. Usually that did not happen. Occasionally it did. One of those politicians that was allowed to visit the general here was a Judge Charles Rapallo of the New York State Court of Appeals. And I don't want to talk about the judge specifically, but I bring him up because I think Judge Rapallo is an answer to a small mystery that occurred here. Let me give you a little background on the mystery. General Grant and his family were avid readers. I was told that as he was growing up, young Ulysses Grant was in a household where the newspapers were read every day, where his father made sure they had a library, and that as an adult, Ulysses Grant followed his father's lead. Anytime he had a spare minute, he would be reading a newspaper, reading books. As his children were growing, he read them stories every day. So, when the Grant family came out on the porch, often they came with books and newspapers. And often those items were left in the wicker chairs when they went back inside. Well, one day I was out here alone, and I glanced and I saw a book I hadn't seen before in one of the wicker chairs. It was a collection of poems by a woman named Hannah F. Gould. How does she tie in with Judge Rapallo? She was the judge's sister-in-law. And it is my supposition that the judge brought as a gift to the General and Mrs. Grant a book of her poetry. I am using her poetry as a way to set up the story of yet another visitor. Miss Gould was a very popular poet when I was a boy. She wrote poems, children's poems, poems about religion and history. Her poems appeared in many magazines and newspapers. And I can remember my mother reading me some of her poems from Godey's Ladies lady's book, they called it. So I knew of Miss Gould as a writer of children's poetry. What I did not know until many years later was that before the Civil War, she was also a writer of poems about abolition and the evils of slavery. I thumbed through that book of poems that was on the porch, and I jotted down a few lines that Miss Gould wrote. And I'm going to read them to you because I want to refresh your memory. We have all forgotten what the world was like before the war. We have forgotten the living hell that was slavery. Ulysses S. Grant led the armies that broke slavery's chains. Abraham Lincoln promised emancipation. The man who died in that bed in that house was the man who actually got the job done. But we have forgotten the years of slavery. Miss Gould, writing before the war, wanted to approach this issue in a way that was not confrontational. So in this particular poem, here's the scene she creates. It is a church on Sunday somewhere in the South, and a black man enters the church, a slave. And he kneels down to pray, believing that all those around him are fellow Christians and that he will be welcomed. But as he starts to pray, he realizes that the congregation is entirely white, and that they are looking at him with hatred, disdain, and they want him out of God's house. So Miss Gould wrote, as this black man is praying, suddenly a thought occurs to him that scares him very badly. Praying to God, he says, Thou art our Maker, and I fain would know if Thou hast different seats prepared above, to which the master and the servant go. It suddenly occurred to the slave that perhaps even heaven was segregated. This preposterous way of thinking was the norm before the war. Black people were not fully human. They did not have souls in the sense that white people did. Our country was deformed by slavery in many ways, including the spiritual. And Miss Gould, in her way, painted a picture of something that was just intolerable. So I remind you of what our world was like before the war, so that I may tell you about a visitor to General Grant. I was out here on the porch, the family was inside, and the train pulled in from Saratoga, the little narrow gauge railway. And a large crowd got off, mostly whites, but there was one black man that got off the train, and of course he stood out in the crowd. I saw him approach the cottage, and he hesitated, and then he turned and he walked up to the hotel. I forgot about him, but 20, 30 minutes later he was back in the company of W.J. Arkell. Mr. Arkell was one of the builders of the Balmoral Hotel and one of the gentlemen that arranged for General Grant to come to this cottage. The black man had found Mr. Arkell. Mr. Arkell escorted him on the porch, and then Mr. Arkell went in to talk to General Grant. So I'm alone with this stranger. And I say hello, and he says hello. And I know with that one word, this man's from the South. I'd heard that accent before. When I was in service, I was in the 16th New York Heavy Artillery. We were sent to Virginia. Not to the Army of the Potomac, but to the Army of the James, which was 40% black. I heard that accent a lot in Virginia. So I knew this man had come up from the South. And I knew what an ordeal that must have been. When the war ended, and the freedmen were put on an equal footing with white citizens, for a period of several years, all the restrictions on black people fell away. They were able to travel without hindrance. They were able to elect people to office. They were able to serve in Congress. And President Grant ensured that these rights would be real during the Reconstruction years. However, once President Grant left office, the old Confederates who had regained power in the southern states began revoking all those rights and privileges that had been given to the freed slaves. And they began to reimpose slavery by another name. And now in the South, we have what are called Jim Crow laws, the black codes. Slavery is almost back, disguised. It is amazing what politicians can say that will make you believe that freedom still exists in the South, but it doesn't. So this man's coming here was not easy. He had to find his way out of the darkness of the South and then find his way to Grant Cottage through states and cities with which he was unfamiliar. In a way, this long trip for this man was an act of courage. Well, in the few minutes we had together, I just assumed that he had been in the Army. He said he had been with General Grant. And I asked, well then, were you with the United States colored troops? So many of the freed slaves were able to enter the Union Army as United States colored troops. And he said no, which really surprised me. I couldn't understand how he could have been with General Grant if he wasn't a soldier. So I asked, well then where were you? And he said, well, I was with General Grant, but I was in the safest place imaginable during the war. I was General Grant's cook. I was at headquarters. I said, ah, all right. Before I could ask his name, Mr. Arkell came out and said, General Grant would love to see you. Please come in. And so this man who had been a slave, he was actually too elderly to be a soldier now that I think about it, who had taken care of our general, as our general was fighting the war, was allowed into the cottage when many politicians were not. And he and the general had a very nice reunion. I learned from stories from the family that General Grant grew, as many of us in the North did, on questions of race relations in this country. You may not know it, but General Grant, in marrying Julia Dent, married into a slave-owning family. They married before the war. So slavery was a very real issue in the Grant household, and the General and Mrs. Grant and all members of the family had to wrestle with the question of the ethics, the morality, the justification for slavery. And they all grew. They all grew. And when that black man walked into this cottage, General Grant was sincerely delighted to see him and embraced him like an old friend. One of the things the war did is it made some of us grow in awareness and compassion. And General Grant was one and I was one. I just want to remind you, as monuments are going up on our battlefields, they are all to white soldiers. But 180,000 black men, mostly freed slaves, fought for the Union. Without them, the war could not have been won. 40,000 of them died in battle, and they were stricken with felted disease while they were in service. This black man's arrival here reminded me of what Ulysses S. Grant meant to an entire race of people, and in terms of revising how we think of one another. What Ulysses S. Grant did during the war continues to have its effects. And I, for one, think they are good effects. Another visitor here, he was here almost every day, a little Mexican man named Matias Romero. He and the general first met when Mr. Romero was called a bandit. Yes, a Mexican bandit. was a good friend of Ulysses S. Grant. But who called Mr. Romero a bandit? The people that had seized Mexico and were then in a war with the Mexican people. During our Civil War, France saw its opportunity. While we were busy trying to save our own country, France invaded Mexico, seized the country, put a puppet emperor on a puppet throne, and declared that all Mexicans who did not support the new regime were bandits. In fact, they were Mexican patriots, and Matias Romero was a Mexican patriot. He came north during our Civil War to ask if our government could in some way help the Mexicans save their own country. Secretary of State Seward told him, "There's nothing we can do until we settle our own issues here." Romero was very sad to hear that, but he asked if he could consult with General Grant. So Mr. Romero wound up going to City Point during the siege of Petersburg, entered General Grant's headquarters, and to his astonishment discovered that General Grant knew everything about what was happening in Mexico. General Grant, I told you, was an avid reader. In every spare minute he had, he read the newspapers. He knew exactly what was happening in Mexico. And he told Romero that he had a special place in his heart for the Mexican people. As you may remember, as a young officer, Grant fought in the Mexican War when we invaded Mexico and conquered her. And General Grant felt that that was an unjust war, that we had provoked a fight for no good reason other than to seize territory and add it to the United States, specifically new territories into which the slave power could move. So Grant felt guilty about serving in the Mexican War. But during the American Army's occupation of Mexico, which went on for several months, he got to know the Mexican people. He fell in love with them. He fell in love with the country. And he, in his heart, decided that if there was any way he could help the Mexican people, he would. And here was Matias Romero coming out of nowhere saying, "We need your help now." And General Grant said, "There is nothing I can do at this minute. It's 1864, and we are locked with General Lee in this siege. God knows when it will end. But when it does end, I promise you, we will do something." And sure enough, in 1865, our war ends, and within 3 months, Grant sends 50,000 American troops to the Mexican border and finds a way to get arms into the hands of the Mexican patriots. There was a very clear warning to the French. If they did not get out, we were going to kick them out. The French left within a year. I don't think General Grant was bluffing. He might have been. But Matias Romero saw Ulysses S. Grant as one of the saviors of his country. And he was eternally grateful to him for what he had done. Romero and Grant stayed in touch for many years. In fact, as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, the Mexican government was negotiating a trade agreement with the United States, and Mr. Romero was the Mexican negotiator and General Grant was the American negotiator. General Grant always had a warm spot in his heart for Mexico and the Mexican people, and they returned that affection. They returned that affection. When Mr. Romero heard that the general had died, that little man wept as if he had lost a father. It was painful to watch. He was a favorite of the Grant grandchildren, Mr. Romero. And I hear that he will become Mexico's ambassador to the United States, and I do wish him well. Another visitor here, Dr. John Gray, director of the Utica Insane Asylum. I'm going to begin this little section of the talk to give you an illustration of General Grant's sense of humor. By this time, the cancer in his throat made it impossible for the general to speak. He could only communicate with little written notes. So I did not hear General Grant speaking to Dr. Gray. I saw him writing a message, and Dr. Gray showed it to me. after their conversation ended. Now, to understand the humor of this, you have to imagine Dr. Gray, a very large man, very large. And General Grant, by this time, the cancer had been eating at him for the better part of a year. And I know you see photographs of him here on the porch, and he doesn't look too bad, but the truth is, those were very floppy clothes, very baggy. Towards the end, the general was almost a walking skeleton. That is how thin he had become. So, the doctor walks up on the porch, the general sees him, smiles, and immediately writes a note. And his note to Dr. Gray reads, "Your shadow has grown no less since I last saw you, but you will notice that mine has." Even in his suffering, General Grant still had a sense of humor. I find that extraordinary. I don't know when he and the doctor first met. I'm going to assume it was shortly after the Lincoln assassination. You remember there was a military commission established to look into the Booth conspiracy. And Dr. Gray was one of the doctors who examined one of the conspirators, Lewis Payne, the Confederate soldier that had been assigned to kill Secretary of State Seward. He slashed at him with a Bowie knife, cut his face to shreds. Seward didn't die. It was a miracle he didn't. But the question was Lewis Payne insane? He ran from Seward's house covered in blood, screaming, "I am mad, I am mad." And it was Dr. Gray who was sent to examine him and establish whether or not he was insane. Dr. Gray's conclusion was he certainly was sane enough to hang. General Grant, of course, was interviewed during the commission's hearing, so I think perhaps that is where they met, way back in 1865. Dr. Gray, by the way, 4 years ago, you remember President Garfield was assassinated. It was, again, Dr. Gray that was asked to interview the assassin, Guiteau, to establish whether he was sane or not. And the doctor concluded that the assassin was not suffering from insanity, but from vanity. He wanted his name in the papers. And Guiteau was the first man, I think, to die in our electric chair here in New York. Yes, I think he was the first. 3 years ago, in reaction to Dr. Gray's decision in the Guiteau case, a man broke into his office at the Utica Asylum and shot him. And as the man pulled the trigger, he yelled, "I am from heaven, and I am a friend to the insane." The man was wrestled to the ground. He was eventually sent to a different asylum. Dr. Gray eventually pulled through, but as he was talking with the general here, and I talked to some of Dr. Gray's friends, they said he's not really recovered. 3 years ago, the wound was almost mortal, and we see him failing now. We see him failing. And I go into such detail on this because it occurs to me that Dr. Gray's only crime, really, was his profession. He wanted to heal broken minds. And sometimes those of us who wish to do nothing but good have to pay a very high price for that. Think of Abraham Lincoln, for example. And I think Dr. Gray and General Grant became so close because Dr. Gray saw a kindred spirit in Ulysses S. Grant. He saw in Grant a man who fundamentally wished to be a healer, a reconciler. Appomattox, in my view, was a moment of healing, not a moment of surrender or victory, but the first step on that road to national reconciliation. Abraham Lincoln had urged us to listen to the better angels of our natures, to bind up our nation's wounds, and at Appomattox, Ulysses S. Grant took the first step in doing that. He could have sent the rebel officers to the gallows as traitors. He could have sent the rebel enlisted men to prison camps. And some in Washington wanted him to do that. But instead, he showed nothing but respect for his former foes. And he said, all I ask is if you swear an allegiance to the government, you may go home. Take your horses, it's planting time. General Grant made it possible for the rebels to believe that there would be no vengeance. It made it possible for proud men to put down their arms and to believe that they would be embraced by the American family again. It was an act of healing. And I think Dr. Gray saw in General Grant a fellow healer. I also think, and what I'm going to say may sound like an invasion of privacy, but I've talked with the Grant family. I have their permission to say this, and this was in the papers some years ago. You may remember it. Some years ago, General Grant's brother Orville was admitted to a lunatic asylum. I don't know if Dr. Gray was involved in that commitment or not, but I want to bring this out because the Grant family has been shown to America as the perfect American family. As I got to know them, I have to tell you, I think that is true. They are the perfect American family. But even in perfect families, there is tragedy. And my point is this. We all feel fundamentally different from General Grant and his family, and yet we are all fundamentally the same because even in perfect families, as in our families, there's tragedy. General Grant and his family are just like us. Another visitor here, Judge Henry Hilton of Saratoga. I know you know him, one of Saratoga's millionaires. Owner of the Grand Union Hotel. And he came here for a very private meeting with the general, I believe, to beg forgiveness. In 1877, a would-be guest walked into the Grand Union Hotel and asked for a room. And Mr. Hilton would not give him a room because Joseph Seligman was a Jew. And this case of anti-Semitism became the most notorious in America for years. I know you remember that. But what you might not know is that Mr. Seligman was a good friend of Ulysses S. Grant, a dear friend of Ulysses S. Grant. They had met when Grant was a young officer stationed in northern New York State at Sackett's Harbor. Mr. Seligman owned a dry goods store in Watertown, he and his brothers. And General Grant and Mrs. Grant often shopped there. General Grant and the Seligman brothers, they were just fast friends. It did not matter to General Grant that they were Jews or Episcopalians or if they had come down from the planet Mars. He took people as they were. And so when his friend Mr. Seligman was barred from the hotel, General Grant did not take it kindly. The Seligman brothers, at their own expense, had outfitted an entire New York regiment during the war. They had sold war bonds for the Union in Europe. Grant, as president, had offered Joseph Seligman a post in his cabinet, which Mr. Seligman had turned down. By this point, the Seligman brothers had moved into banking. They were doing very well financially. When our government was close to default after the war, the Seligman brothers loaned them money so that our nation would not default. They were patriots from beginning to end. General Grant knew that, and he was not happy with Judge Hilton when Mr. Seligman was barred from the hotel. So all these years later, I believe that Judge Hilton came here to ask Ulysses S. Grant to forgive him. And I have no doubt that a man who could forgive traitors could also forgive a bigot. General Grant had a great heart. I know he did. But this story to me has special poignance because you might not know this. During the war, General Grant himself was accused of anti-Semitism. It's an involved story. There's no point in going into it in any detail. The point is, he was accused. And for many years, That hung over him, that cloud. But he was not an anti-Semite. He was the first president to attend worship in a synagogue. He contributed to a building fund for a synagogue in Washington, D.C. He appointed Jewish people to many posts in his government. And in the end, during his presidency, the Jewish community backed him wholeheartedly. Although during the war, they believed this canard, that he was a bigot. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that he was. One of the great things about General Grant, as I've said, is he could grow. He could grow. When he thought about race relationships, I know he did. When he talked about religious differences, I'm beginning to believe he grew immensely on that score as well. He was an example which I think all of us should follow, and yet we only remember him as a war hero. It was much more than that, so much more. Another visitor here, Father Edmund Didier, of the pastor of St. Vincent's Church in Baltimore, Maryland. And the father brought good wishes from James Cardinal Gibbons and told the general, "We are praying for you." That came from the Catholic community. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but during his presidency, Ulysses S. Grant was accused of being anti-Catholic. This was one of those great American misunderstandings. It still goes on. It has to do with the separation of church and state. President Grant, I think he admitted that he was no constitutional scholar, but he believed in the separation of church and state. Philosophically, it made sense to him, and he also thought keeping the government out of places of worship adds to their safety too. So President Grant's position was that in no way should the federal government penalize or reward institutions of worship. Shouldn't be giving them money, shouldn't be giving special tax breaks. He thought maybe a constitutional amendment would clarify the issue. For him, it was really a question of separation of church and state. He said, "Leave the matter of religion to the family altar. The church and private schools supported entirely by private contributions." Now, for Catholics in this country, the fact is, they were persecuted from the beginning here, even before we were a country. So they assumed that President Grant's perspective on aid to religious institutions was aimed at them. And who can blame them? Given the prejudices that they have endured since we were a colony of Great Britain, really. So this was a great misunderstanding. And when the father came here, Father Didier came here to offer reconciliation, that was a greater moment than you can know, because it was a statement by the people of Catholic faith that they understood they had misjudged President Grant. Now, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. I hope you don't mind. General Grant had a sense of humor, and even in a situation like this, which I think is solemn, and I don't think he would mind a good laugh. So I'm going to try and make you laugh. I did not know Father Didier at all, but oddly enough, I had heard of his brother Eugene. Eugene Didier was an author, rather famous author in his day, and I'd read many of his works. He had only one failing, though. He was obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe. He would write about nothing except Edgar Allan Poe and his works. Magazine articles, newspaper articles, books. He wrote a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. Eugene Didier did this. And in one of his biographies of Edgar Allan Poe, I read this, and I hope this will make you laugh eventually. Did you know that, like Ulysses S. Grant, Edgar Allan Poe was a cadet at West Point? Like Ulysses S. Grant, Edgar Allan Poe was not charmed by his military studies. He didn't want to be a soldier. He was forced to go. Like Ulysses S. Grant, Edgar Allan Poe spent most of his time in the West Point Academy Library reading novels. Well, it was Grant that read the novels. Poe mostly read poetry, as it turns out. Both Grant and Poe wanted to leave the academy. That's how much they disliked it. And General Grant pinned his hopes on the possibility that Congress was going to close the academy. There were debates about that while he was a cadet. And in the end, the academy didn't close. Grant did not see any honorable way he could leave, so he stayed. Poe, on the other hand, the situation in those days was that if you were to leave, if a cadet was to leave, he had to get permission from his father to leave, or his guardian. And Edgar Allan Poe had a guardian. He had a stepfather who would not let him withdraw from the academy. So, unable to get his stepfather's permission, Poe began to non-cooperate with West Point. He would not go to classes. He would not march at drill. He would not march to meals. In short, he stopped functioning as a cadet, and eventually the academy kicked him out. Here's why I'm going with this. What if it was Grant who had left West Point and Poe who had stayed? We have discovered through the General's memoirs that he is gifted as a writer. Perhaps the civilian Ulysses S. Grant would have written the great American novel. On the other side